So my name is Imani Jacqueline Brown. I'm originally from New Orleans and I'm currently based in London in the United Kingdom. I came into my artistic practice through activism. I used to make material objects when I was much younger, and but also have been an activist since I was very young. And it was really through Occupy Wall Street that these two kind of areas of my life fused. And I've been just kind of following this path since. I make work. I kind of increasingly add different types of titles or identities and shed them just as easily depending on the circumstance, depending on who I'm speaking with. Sometimes I call myself an artist, sometimes I don't. Sometimes I call myself an activist and sometimes I don't. Sometimes I feel like these words, by my claiming these words, is a form of self-empowerment, and sometimes I feel that I'm taking something from someone else by using them. But then again, maybe these are old conversations I have with myself, and I've pretty much just settled into doing work that I find important and meaningful. I think it's important and meaningful to disentangle the complex systems of bureaucracy. And I find it really important to bring to light the way that bureaucracy is a form of violence, that it has racist and colonial underpinnings. And so the work that I do is largely entangling these bureaucratic systems that, at first might seem mundane or banal, but are in fact, systems that permit, through often the issuance of permits, through policy that enable the unraveling of our world socially, ecologically, and politically. So I guess the medium that I work with, I would say, is is bureaucracy. Some of the tools that I work with include, I guess, what one might call political action research. I've heard this phrase before. I don't know yet if I claim it, but working as an individual civilian, as a person, as a resident, as a human, who is curious about the world around me, why it is the way it is, and wants to unpack it, find out what policies have made it this way, and communicate those policies to the wider public. Yeah, so the two pieces that I have in the show are works in progress. I think that most of my work is work in progress, and I'm not used to showing work in gallery settings. The work in the show includes two posters that are exploring the making and the disintegration of the Mississippi River Delta, which is my homeland. So essentially, my current work is largely focused on the way that the fossil fuel industry maintains the logics and legacies of colonialism and slavery. And in Louisiana, the fossil fuel industry has really claimed the space of colonialism and slavery. The claimed the position within our economy and our local culture. So Louisiana once hosted the largest slave market in North America. And in the early 20th century, some of the country's most productive oil fields were discovered in Louisiana's wetlands. Indigenous communities were pushed from lands throughout the region along the Mississippi River, where they formerly lived, along with the river's sort of ebbs and flows. As the river moved, they would move. And when French colonists arrived 300 years ago, they dispossessed them of their land, pushed them to the southernmost wisps of land in the wetlands, where they rebuilt their communities. The French vision for this land was incompatible with that lifestyle, and so they and their successors, the Spanish and in some cases the Germans, and ultimately U.S. Americans, strangled and corseted the river with levees and locks, and terraformed the land along the river into sugarcane plantations, where some of my ancestors labored as slaves. The terraforming of this land along the river, in fact, loosened the soil up and down the Mississippi, and the soil was carried by the current and joined in with the alluvial flow of the Mississippi River, aggregating more land than ever before at the river's mouth. And so the land that we know today as the Bird's Foot Delta, which we have so named because it resembles the foot of a raptor, is in large part a product of a colonial imaginary. It is comprised of sediment that was deposited there as part of colonial land reclamation, quote unquote. So the works in this show are thinking about what it means to fight to defend this land, because today this land is eroding at one of the fastest rates in the world. Louisiana has lost nearly 2,000 square miles of wetlands since oil was first discovered. Now, of course, for something to be lost, someone must have actively lost it. So the oil industry lost this land when they dredged 10,000 miles of oil and gas access canals in order to drill 75,000 wells, which then carry oil and gas via 50,000 miles of pipelines to 200 petrochemical plants that occupy the footprints of former sugarcane plantations. Now, the people who are at the front line of this land loss are, of course, the indigenous peoples who were pushed down from higher grounds. And as this sediment disintegrates as a result of saltwater intrusion from these oil and gas canals, a lot of aquatic bodies, bays, bayous, lakes, are themselves disintegrating because the land that forms their perimeters no longer exists. So the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in the last decade has removed over 30 such aquatic bodies from their nautical maps, along with the names that are attached to them. And we in Louisiana have been mourning the loss of these aquatic bodies, have been mourning the loss of the names. But we also have to recognize that these names are also a part of the colonial imaginary. So the work, is very much just a research product, a part of a phase of research, thinking through what all this means. What does it mean to love this conflicted ecosystem? What does it mean when these colonial names, these colonial designations are themselves being dispossessed by the same logics and landscapes that dispossess the region's first peoples? And what does it mean for us all as we're trying to figure out who we are in relation to this place, and where we will be in that place? And I say we, of course, from a vantage very far away from that place. So an aspect of my work that is not really included in these posters is a lot of thinking about this sort of position of chosen exile. So reflecting on this loss of home from this additional vantage. Yeah, so when I was working on a project called Lights Out in New Orleans, we produced a body of work called The Living Glossary, and it was essentially an attempt to define these develop this development terminology through not, to define it in a denotative sense, right? Like not what the dictionary said, although we did look there in order to unpack it, but really to kind of unearth the deeper meanings of these words, and then fill them out with lived experience, with testimony from people who have been impacted by these weaponized words, right? So we looked at gentrification, and there were some very clear sort of cultural and value judgments that were easily revealed by examining dictionary definitions. So gentrification, these definitions said, is a process of replacing one population with another. I'm paraphrasing, of course. It's a process of imposing the values of middle class and upper class people on lower class people. It is, and there are lots of words that they use, like these value words, like to make better, to ameliorate, et cetera, et cetera. But one thing that every single dictionary definition that we looked at had in common is that it involved displacement of lower class people by middle and upper class people, right? So, to me, that is, gentrification is itself, and it does relate to the work in the show, because gentrification is itself an inheritance of a colonial mentality. Colonialism was the first gentrification. Gentry, of course, are just the upper class, right? And, when French and English and Spanish, et cetera, later US American settler colonists arrived in the US, or arrived in Turtle Island, which eventually became the US. They needed to use certain tools to justify within their worldview the genocide of an entire continent of people. Recognizing, of course, that many people resisted, survived, live. And some of these tools included vacuum domicilium, which was created by a man called John Winthrop, which means basically empty domicile. So it's said that the land that indigenous people lived on is empty, and therefore open for colonization. And vacuum domicilium and other such technologies like terra nullius, no man's land, right? Were used to justify the clearing of the land, the dispossession and massacre of the land's people, and then the literal clearing of the land, right, to prepare it for cultivation. So there first had to be a value judgment that the way that the people who lived on this land were inferior to the people who had come to replace them. There was a value judgment that their ways of living with the land were inferior to modes of production that would extract value from the land. And ultimately, we've learned that these modes of production that extract value from the land, they extract the soul from humanity, they extract the future from the planet. And they position us all toward, this possibility, this never before seen possibility of self-created annihilation. So ultimately, a degentrified future would be a future wherein we reject these colonial values. It would be, I guess, what Ariella Azoulay would call, a potential future, to paraphrase her phrase, potential history, right? Where the values that, were dispossessed from lands around the world are reinstated, where people's lives are reinfused with meaning, where people are reinfused with meaning, and where the earth is reinfused with its inherent dignity and value.